Hello, everyone. So my name is Aaron Denford. I am the marketing manager here at AppTutti. AppTutti is a portal for game developers to self-publish their games in China. And today I'm going to be talking about localizing your game. Now, that term localization covers many different aspects. So I'll be talking through translation, language, payments, and what we like to call the 4 Rs. So I hope you're all doing very well. If you have any questions for me, please leave them in the chat. If I miss anything or you'd like me to explain a point further, I wish I could have been there with you in the audience, but I'm sure you will miss it as much as me. So for the first part, it's why would someone be interested in localizing their game for China? I think this isn't something I need to spend too long on, considering that China is currently the leading gaming market in the world, with over 691 million mobile gamers, a huge esports market, 27% of all worldwide game spending originating from China, and the revenue expecting to grow to 42 billion by 2023. It's a very attractive market for a lot of developers, and I think the reason for this talk, and as we have experience with localizing games for the Chinese market, is to give those that are maybe just slightly interested or haven't really done much research a broader overview for what they may be expecting if they go down this path. So the first thing is translation itself. So translating or any game into any other language is vital if you want to make a good user experience for the local users and grow your games. I'm sure I don't need to define translation to you. One of the problems it poses when translating Anglo-Saxon or non-Asian languages into Chinese is quite plentiful. Chinese itself is a very old language and it has many different aspects that influence the culture and the text itself. So, for this example, um, there is simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese. You may have been like me before I lived in China and just thought Chinese itself was just one language. However, they have two different written systems. They have the simplified Chinese, which you can see on the left, mainly used in mainland China and Singapore, and the traditional Chinese, which is using the old characters that haven't been updated to the simplified versions. So this character means is guan. It means like close. And as you can see, there is a huge difference between the two of them. Um, the one on the right, the two characters that you can see on the left and the right, those symbolize doors. And even though I've been here for a while, I cannot tell you how they got from the one on the right to the one on the left. But what is important to note is that simplified Chinese is now the standard across all gaming or literature or movies text across China. So if you're targeting Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Malaysia specifically, you may be interested in looking more into traditional Chinese text. Whereas if you're going for mainland China and Singapore, simplified Chinese is what you should be localizing your game into. Another thing to note is that Chinese is a uniquely concise language. So the number of in-game characters is normally less than the equivalent sentence in the translated language. So, for instance, this sentence here, Shenzhen, the next station is Shenzhen North. In Chinese, it's condensed a lot more into 下一站是深圳北, which is the same meaning. However, as you can see, the text on the top took up a lot more space. So when you condense it into or localize it into Chinese, it will be a lot more concise. So one thing that you may be that I may perhaps give you a tip on is that code scalable text boxes during development can save you a lot of time when localizing your game to the other languages, as a sentence that may be two or three Lines in English may be condensed to simply just one line in the Chinese language specifically. So these aspects, when you work with a translator or a localization company, they should be able to help you to do the quality control before obviously you publish the localized version. I think it's important to make sure that the text especially is readable for the local users to give them the best impression of your projects coming in. Another thing to note is that there are many different fonts in Chinese. There are over 80,000 characters. Um, we have 20. We have just the A to Z, which makes the language for English especially much. You only need to know essentially those A to Z letters, whereas for Chinese, it's a character-based system. Now, the average literacy level is around 5 to 6,000. However, when you come to font, as you can see here, the graffiti on our train car, some hooligan has graffitied our train car. But another thing to note is if you're trying to match a certain font from your original project into Chinese, there are many options open to you. However, working with a localization company or a service provider such as AppTutti, they can help you try and match the correct Chinese font to the existing font in your game. Moving on to language, so Chinese language and grammar can actually be quite simple. They don't have tenses, for instance, past tense or future tense. Um, they don't have verb conjunction, and they don't have plural nouns per se. They just simply add an extra character onto it. So with this direct translation from English to Chinese can often read unnaturally if you were to do it through Google Translate or Bing Translate, or any of these not very reputable translation services. For instance, there's been many times when I've tried to Google Translate a sentence, given it to my Chinese colleagues, and they're just like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So you may be thinking, and we've had some examples where developers have simply inputted their games text or apps text into one of these translation programs, and it's very much like unable to understand for the local users. So this is where understanding the local grammar rules can come in really helpful, and working with a localization team. So the Chinese script can also pack lots of possible meaning into each character. So a character by itself, when combined with many other characters, can change the meaning drastically. So even though I've been here for a while, sometimes I cannot understand how one character can mean so many different things, but it could also be applied to any language. In English, we also have those examples, and the use of wordplay is very common in Chinese. They are actually very comical in their use of wordplay. However, it rarely translates well um, from other languages to Chinese or from Chinese to other languages. If you have like a play on words kind of joke, it will require a certain time spending with the localizers to understand the contextual meaning, what you're trying to achieve with this joke. It's very rare that a simple wordplay joke can be easily translated. Another thing to note is that Chinese can be written from top to down. Um, so there may be a situation where that is suggested to you. It's now more commonly read from left to right. However, it can be read from top to down. One of the main issues with translation comes from like the in-game items, such as spells, power-ups, inventory lists. Contextual information is needed in order to translate them correctly. When you're working with a translation or localization company, you may need to accompany images or descriptions of what exactly that weapon or spell does. Um, and additionally, there are some icons and images embedded in text will often need to be redesigned to accommodate for the different area the text will take up in those in-game inventory lists or powers or spells. So the other part that we have here is the culture. Um, this could be an entirely different topic on its own. Um, I won't pretend that I'm an expert on Chinese culture, but as I have been living here for over 5 years, I'd like to think I'm very um, familiar with some of the different cultural aspects of China. So one is art style. So, for instance, Chinese players prefer very perfectly beautiful and handsome characters in games, whereas in the West we don't mind cartoony or very realistic art styles. Seem to be a slightly more popular. However, in China, they really like to see and interact with very visually appealing and beautiful and handsome and very kind of, to borrow a Japanese word, kawaii, very cute characters. Another thing to note is that opening trailers and voice acting is very popular in China, in the Chinese market. Even for mobile games, you'll have very detailed trailers. So the example that I'm going to show you here is from for a mobile game called Perfect World that was released in China in around 2018. And you might think that this is like a PC game or the new generation of consoles game. However, this is made for mobile, and this was just a short selection to show you um, the effort that the companies and developers go into to make their trailers appealable for the Chinese market. Did you see that frown into the eyes? Very beautiful. So that may be another aspect that developers from overseas may want to take into account if they're bringing certain projects in, is localizing the voiceovers. Um, so as there was simplified and traditional, there is also Mandarin and Cantonese. Cantonese being spoken in Taiwan, uh, well, sorry, not Taiwan, in Hong Kong and other parts of southern China. However, Mandarin would be the voice over language that reaches the most uh, users. Not to mention, there's over 200 different dialects, but I would suggest Mandarin. Another cultural element is the local users' preferences when playing games. Western games can sometimes have a very steep difficulty curve, and also they can restrict session length directly. However, Chinese apps and games, they tend to slow down the progress but not restrict it completely. They also have a very gradual difficulty curve, and the tutorial aspect of your game, or the first couple of levels of your game, um, in the West, you may find that after two or three tutorial levels or aspects or gameplay, that the players will understand what is required for them. Whereas in China, they very much need more of a helping hand. I wouldn't say need, but they are very much more accustomed to a very slow ramp up at the beginning. And top Chinese games integrate deep social mechanics, PvP, direct trading, guilds, co-op. You'll find that a lot of the Chinese games have very deep social aspects inside of them that increases the user retention and user engagement of the apps and games, as you can see here. Another thing to note is payments. So I won't get into exactly the 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 regulation side of things for releasing a payment an in-app purchase game inside of China, but let's say that you have a game ready to be released with in-app purchases. In the West, we may be used to PayPal or credit card as the main payment methods. However, in China, they will mainly be using Alipay, WeChat Pay, and Union Pay. And with this change, you will need to, of course, have different SDKs inside of your apps. With all of these different payment methods comes different SDKs that you will have to work with: WeChat, Alipay, Union Pay, for example, which can be uh, quite a substantial workload for a smaller development team. So when you're working with someone local inside of China, they will be able to help you more efficiently with in or trans with localizing your games to the local payment methods. So instead of a PayPal, you may have the Alipay and Union Pay options available for monetization. Excuse me, it's quite late here in China, but I hope you're all having a good day for the payment methods inside. So moving on to the last part is the 4 Rs. This is not a concept unique to AppTutti, but we found that it's the best way to describe some of the ways that you may consider culturalizing your game to China. So the first would be to rewrite. So, for instance, politics has always been a sensitive topic for Chinese authorities. So, if your game has anything anti establishment or a very unwholesome backstory, this may hinder your game success when it comes to the regulatory authorities inside of China. So, there may be some and we have some examples. We had a horror game that we released in China, and when we were applying for the ISBN and IP certificate for this game in order to advertise through in-app purchases, there were some changes that needed to be made initially before we gave it to the regulatory authorities because from our experience we just knew it wouldn't be accepted. So, for instance, instead of walking around and stealing wallets, we would instead change it to that you have to find coins throughout the levels. And instead of a very dark backstory, we would change it into a more wholesome, uh, more family friendly backstory. So if you're trying to get your games through the ISBN and IP certificate process in China, rewriting some of the elements of your games will most likely be suggested from whichever partner that you work with. The next would be rebranding. Um, so titles based on Western celebrities or Western intellectual property. Many of the users here will not know Western celebrities. Um, So there may be some cases where you would like to localize the content. Depending on what your IP or your game is, it may just be that there are no users in China that are familiar, or there will be some, but not a majority. So we like to suggest putting some culturalized elements inside of there. For instance, if the game has, there was one example we had where the games had some medieval castles, which we would change to more of like ancient Chinese com- not compounds, like ancient Chinese buildings. So they do enjoy many Western titles, but the majority prefer localized content. And one thing that AppTutti does is, and we pride ourselves on, is bringing foreign creativity and new IPs into China, because we do really think that there is a massive need and want from local users to have these new outside perspectives and new creativity come in. However, if your game is an MMORPG set in 1066 Battle of Hastings, medieval Europe, it may not find as much traction as you would find in other markets. And renaming. So this is one of our examples of a game called Rento, where you're essentially, it's a multiplayer or single player game where you collect properties and trade with players. So the renaming of the game became, in English, it essentially means rich man battle. So again, like it's hard to directly translate that. I will try my best with my poor toned Chinese, but it's 富王打左战, which, like I said, essentially means rich man battle. Some other things to note is that a lot of the most common English words, such as okay, cool, um, they are widely known inside of China. So you can feel free to keep them in English. There are cases where there will be some times where using English titles, or one part of the title is English, is totally okay. And finally, we have redesign. So I'm sure many of you know that no blood or drugs or skulls, skeletons, gambling, sexual themes are permitted in games in the People's Republic of China. So if you publish a shooting game, you may not be available. You may not be able to avoid bloody scenes. However, if you simply make the bodies disappear or go up in a puff of cloud, that can be enough to make it through this redesign stage. Essentially, no gory graphic elements are allowed. So we've worked with developers before where we've removed blood stains from their games, or when a character dies, we don't see their body stay on the floor dead. They will instead melt into the floor or disappear. So when you're working with professional localizers, they should all be very well aware of these issues and should be able to point out what will and won't be allowed. Because you're essentially, if you're trying to get into the multi-billion market, you're going to want to make sure that your game doesn't get denied as soon as you go in. If you do a little bit of localization beforehand, or at least be prepared for some of the things that you need to change, it can mean that your publication journey and journey into the Chinese market will be a lot easier and hopefully bear fruits for you as an overseas developer. So with that said, I'd like to thank you all for taking this train, the Orient Express, from west to east, and we hope to see you in China. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you for such a very interesting information actually about Chinese language, and generally, I've actually learned a lot of new things today. Thank you. Actually, coming out of that question, what if, for instance, you do make mistakes in localization, and in your opinion, in your expertise, how do Chinese people react? Is it like an absolute offensive something, or they are like, can be okay about that?
So I don't think it's the hopefully you won't translate anything into too offensive. I can't imagine there will be many times where you accidentally translate something. There are some superstitious examples, for instance, like the word "for" in Chinese sounds a lot like death. So like "si." So even there's some cases where in buildings they will remove the fourth floor entirely. You'll just go from 3 to 5. But I don't think there's any cases where you're really upset the local user. There will just be a case of confusion and perhaps negative user experience.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And in your, well, you've basically shared all these tips, but in your experience, basically, what are the maybe top three, I don't know, major mistakes that developers make when basically going to China? The most common mistakes.
Um, so I think one is expecting their 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 app or game to be able to just be instantly shipped. We found that developers sometimes struggle to understand why exactly that we ask them to remove foreign ad networks or foreign social payment, social logins or foreign payment options, and that's simply because the stores themselves will not be able to accept any foreign elements inside of their game. So one, I would say, they're the developers. I'd love to spread the word that you will be required to remove overseas elements inside of your game. The second would be some examples of poor translation. We do offer a free translation service. However, there's, like I've said before, some developers may just put their text inside of Google Translate, and then when our testers are playing the game, it kind of causes a roadblock where we then have to ask them, like, was this translated by yourselves or from a different translation company? And then we have to get the English content back and use our translators to do it again. And I think those are the two major ones that I come across on my day to day
Hmm.
experience.
Thank you very much. So keep in mind that. um, and the last question, I believe for now, what countries submit the most games to AppTutti? Do you have
Oh,
that information?
that's a really good question. So we have, I think we're only around 40 or 30 countries away from having a developer from everywhere in the world, which
Oh
is
wow.
which is great. If we can get one person from Antarctica to submit their game, that might be the hardest. But I'd say we have a lot of submissions from Ukraine and Russia. We found Pakistan and Turkey to be really a large amount of developers there too, and also the United Kingdom. We've had some really good submissions from the United Kingdom. In fact, recently Nitrome, the developer Nitrome that made a game called Bomb Chicken, was a we were able to publish Bomb Chicken inside of China for them. So we have a very diverse, because our process is very much self publication. You can do it from anywhere. We have a very diverse and spread out geographical area for partners.
Hmm. Thank you very much. And we have one more question actually from Gulsah Hamurku. Hopefully I pronounced it correctly. Sorry if not. Is China passing to payment system Bitcoin virtual money for games? Not game money, but totally new economic system.
So um, I would say that the current payment systems inside of China are very robust, and many for instance, I can pay my utilities, my taxi, everything from what's called my WeChat wallet. There was some expansion into virtual currency, Bitcoin, Ethereum. However, I believe from the last I researched into it is that the government was going to start regulating the Bitcoin type virtual money. I haven't seen any developments on that since. Um, and if I do, I'd be happy to let Golsa know.
Hmm.
So
Thank you very
I would say no for the moment, no, but I could be wrong.
Thank you very much for your answers and very interesting presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Learned a lot of things. Yeah. If dear audience, if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask Aaron later after the session. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer them, right?
Yep. I will stay for a while in the chat and I will drink a little drink to the next speaker. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, I guess, for you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.